Robert thought he knew what his life was: 30 years of marriage to Amy, a love that began in high school, and a quiet, stable life in their small-town apartment. They had a grown daughter, a comfortable routine, and memories built on trust. But one night, a single text on Amy's phone shattered that illusion, sending Robert down a path he never expected. What began as a nagging doubt spiraled into a web of lies, hidden rendezvous, and a betrayal deeper than he could have imagined. How well do we ever truly know the ones we love? For Robert, the answer would change everything. I've always thought of our life as the kind of story people envy. Amy and I were high school sweethearts, married for 30 years now, and living a modest but comfortable life in our apartment on the 18th floor of a newly built high-rise. From our balcony, the view stretched out over our small town, a quilt of parks, rooftops, and distant hills. It felt like a symbol of everything we'd built together. We had our share of ups and downs, but we always found our way back to each other. At least, that's what I believed. Our daughter, Emma, was the light of our lives. Now in her late 20s, she'd moved to the West Coast to pursue her career but stayed close in spirit. We always joked that she was the best thing we'd ever done. Between Amy's demanding shifts as a nurse and my work in the city's marketing department, we didn't get many moments to reflect. But that was life. Busy, chaotic, and, I thought, honest. That night, it started the way most ordinary nights do. Amy was already asleep, her phone resting on the nightstand. I stayed up late, scrolling mindlessly through the news while waiting for sleep to catch up with me. I heard her phone buzz once, twice, persistent but faint under her soft snores. Normally, I wouldn't pay it any mind, but it was unusual for her to get messages at that hour. Curiosity got the better of me. Without thinking, I leaned over and glanced at the screen. A notification previewed a message from Rachel, her old friend from nursing school. It seemed harmless. But as I reached to turn off the bedside lamp, another buzz followed. This time, my eyes caught more than just the name. I miss you already. Can't wait for the next time. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I convinced myself it must be a misunderstanding. Maybe Rachel was teasing, or it was an inside joke. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Amy stirred in her sleep, turning away from me. Her phone sat inches away, locked and silent, its secrets tucked behind a passcode I didn't know. I stared at it, my heart pounding, a storm building in my chest. Something was wrong. And I needed to know what. The next morning, Amy went about her routine as if nothing had changed. She kissed my cheek before heading out the door, her scrubs neatly pressed, her hair tied back in the casual ponytail she always wore for work. "Don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning," she said with a smile, her tone light, as though she hadn't left a thread dangling from my thoughts all night. I nodded absently, gripping my coffee mug. "Sure. Have a good day." She was gone before I could study her expression further. Part of me wanted to shake off what I'd seen as a misunderstanding. But that message, those words, clung to me like smoke. They didn't fit with the Amy I knew, or the life we had built together. Yet there they were, etched in my mind, pulling me into the kind of doubt I never thought I'd feel about her. At work, I couldn't focus. Campaign briefs blurred in front of me, phone calls felt distant, and even the lunchtime chatter in the break room sounded muffled. All I could think about was her phone, the message, and the door it had cracked open. By the time I got home, I had resolved to put the thoughts aside. I'd talk to Amy, I told myself. Ask her about it directly. She deserved the benefit of the doubt, didn't she? But as the evening wore on, my resolve wavered. She was calm, affectionate even, laughing at a rerun of her favorite sitcom as she folded laundry on the couch. If she was hiding something, she hid it well. Meanwhile, I felt like a stranger in my own skin, rehearsing questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. Later that night, while she showered, I noticed her phone on the kitchen counter. My pulse quickened as I approached it. She never left her phone lying around, not out of secrecy, but because she was glued to it for work updates. This was an opportunity. A quiet voice in my head told me to leave it alone, but my hand moved on its own. The screen lit up as I picked it up. A text notification from Rachel was waiting. My thumb hovered over the message, and then, before I could lose my nerve, I swiped it open. It wasn't Rachel. The contact name was a lie. The thread of messages told a story that stole the air from my lungs. Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible. I'm still smiling. Missed calls, can't talk right now. Amy says she's working late tonight. My legs buckled slightly as the truth slammed into me. Amy wasn't messaging her old friend from nursing school. She was talking to someone else entirely. Someone who knew her in ways I couldn't bring myself to imagine. The sound of the water shutting off upstairs jolted me from my trance. I scrambled to lock her phone and place it back on the counter. My hands shook as I turned to the sink, pretending to rinse a dish. Amy came downstairs moments later, her hair damp, her robe wrapped loosely around her. "What are you doing?" she asked, smiling softly. I forced a laugh, though my chest felt like it might collapse. "Just finishing up," I said, barely meeting her eyes. She kissed my cheek, and I felt her warmth like a blade. "Don't stay up too late," she said lightly, heading toward the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen long after she left, gripping the counter and trying to breathe through the tidal wave of disbelief and pain. There was no denying it anymore. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the answers. The next morning, the air felt heavier. Amy moved about the apartment with her usual ease, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. I sat at the table with the newspaper open in front of me, pretending to read, while my mind churned through the damning evidence I'd seen. My thoughts were relentless, replaying the words on her phone like a cruel mantra. I knew I couldn't keep quiet forever, but how could I confront her without understanding the full scope of what was happening? I needed answers, facts, before I said anything. Still, sitting there as if everything was normal made my stomach turn. "Robert, are you okay?" Amy's voice pulled me from my thoughts. She stood across from me, holding a steaming cup of coffee, her brow furrowed in concern. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well," I lied, shifting in my chair. She reached over, brushing a hand against my arm. "Don't work too hard, okay? You've seemed distracted lately." The irony of her words was almost laughable. Distracted? Of course, I was distracted, by the double life she seemed to be living right under my nose. I managed a nod, mumbling something about deadlines at work, and she seemed satisfied with the answer. As she left for her shift, I felt the tension drain from the room, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. The apartment was quiet now, and for the first time, I allowed myself to let the facade crack. My hands trembled as I sat back down, replaying every interaction from the last few months, searching for clues I'd missed. By the time I headed into the city for work, a plan had begun to form in the back of my mind. If Amy was hiding something, I needed proof. Real proof, not just the fragments I'd stumbled upon. That evening, after dinner, I casually brought up her phone. "Hey, have you been in touch with Rachel lately?" I asked, keeping my tone light as I cleared the table. Amy looked up, her expression calm. "Rachel? Not much." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious. I thought I saw her name pop up the other day when your phone buzzed." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "We send each other memes now and then, but it's nothing exciting. She's still in Florida, working at that clinic." Her response was smooth, almost practiced, and it sent a chill down my spine. How easily she lied, as if it were second nature. I swallowed the knot forming in my throat, forcing myself to smile. "Got it. Just wondered," I said, turning away so she couldn't see my face. Later that night, as she slept, I took a risk. With my phone in hand, I searched online for ways to retrieve deleted messages and track activity. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I felt like a man drowning, grasping at anything that might pull me to the surface. After hours of research, I found something, a tool that could clone her phone's data onto mine. It wasn't foolproof, but it might give me the answers I needed. My heart pounded as I downloaded the software, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Was this who I had become? A husband sneaking around, spying on the woman he loved? But I couldn't stop. The need to know was too strong. The next morning, I waited until Amy was distracted in the kitchen. Her phone sat on the counter, unguarded, while she chatted about her weekend plans with her coworkers. My hands shook as I connected it to the cloning tool, praying she wouldn't notice. It only took a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the process finished, I disconnected the device and returned her phone to its place. Amy hadn't even glanced my way. That night, when she left for her shift at the hospital, I sat in the quiet of our living room and opened the app. My heart raced as I scrolled through the mirrored contents of her phone. Messages, photos, call logs, they were all there. And then I saw it. A string of messages from the same contact signed as Rachel. Messages that weren't just friendly. Messages that made my chest tighten with rage and despair. Can't wait to see you again. Same place next week. Missed you today. It's hard being apart. You always know how to make me smile, love. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was devastating. Amy wasn't just lying. She was living a separate life, a life that didn't include me. By the time Amy returned home that night, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. The messages on her phone had painted a picture that no explanation could justify. Every word I read chipped away at the foundation of 30 years of trust, leaving behind a hollow shell of disbelief and anger. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I pretended to be asleep when she slipped into bed beside me. She smelled of soap and a faint antiseptic scent from the hospital, a scent I'd always found comforting. But now, it only stirred bitterness. Who was she really when she wasn't here? What lies had she told to keep her two lives separate? The next day, I couldn't bear to go to work. I called in sick, using a vague excuse about feeling under the weather. Amy didn't ask too many questions, just kissed my forehead lightly before heading out the door. "I'll check in later, okay?" she said, her voice warm and concerned. I nodded, watching her leave. Once she was gone, the quiet of the apartment felt suffocating. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, as I replayed her words and the messages I'd seen. There was no denying it anymore, Amy had betrayed me. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone had been keeping secrets so dark and deep I could barely stand to think of them. I couldn't let it stay this way. I needed to know the full truth. That evening, while Amy was out running errands, I began piecing together a timeline. Her late shifts, her trips to visit friends, the weekends I'd spent home alone while she claimed to be working. Every gap in her schedule became suspect. I pored over her messages again, combing through the digital trail she hadn't realized she was leaving behind. It wasn't long before I found him. His name was Jeff. His contact photo was a simple, blurry shot of a man's silhouette standing by a lake, but the messages made it clear who he was to Amy. "I wish we didn't have to hide," he'd written 2 nights ago. Amy had responded, "I know. But we agreed, no risks. We can't let him find out." The word struck me like a physical blow. She wasn't just lying, she was planning. Strategizing. Protecting their affair like it was something precious. My stomach churned as I scrolled further. The texts revealed a pattern: lunch dates when I was at work, stolen evenings when she was stuck at the hospital, and overnight stays in hotel rooms she hadn't bothered to explain. He was older than her, that much was clear from the way she referred to him, calling him Jeff in some messages and Jay in others. I couldn't sit still. My hands shook as I paced the living room, my thoughts spiraling. 30 years. 30 years of marriage, of building a life together, and this was how it ended. With lies and stolen moments with a man I'd never even heard of. I thought of our daughter, Emma. What would she think if she knew? Would she blame me? Or would she see the cracks in our marriage for what they were, a betrayal so deep it felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared? When Amy walked in that evening, her face lit up at the sight of me. "Hey," she said softly, setting her bag on the counter. "Feeling better?" I stared at her, searching for any sign of guilt, any hint of the truth hidden behind her warm smile. But she was unreadable, her face a mask of casual affection. "Yeah," I said, forcing the word out. "Just needed some rest." As she walked past me toward the bedroom, my fists clenched at my sides. I wanted to grab her, to shake the truth out of her, to demand she explain how she could throw away everything we'd built. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed more. More proof. More time to process the depth of what I'd discovered. Because once I confronted her, there would be no turning back. The days that followed were a blur. I felt like I was living two lives, one where everything appeared normal, and another where I was slowly unraveling the truth behind Amy's betrayal. Every smile she gave me felt forced, every touch hollow, as though the weight of what I knew had drained the life from our interactions. I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. I didn't know how or when, but I was certain of one thing: when the moment came, I wouldn't go into it unarmed. By the end of the week, I had pieced together enough from her phone to identify where she was meeting Jeff. The messages had mentioned a restaurant in town, La Bella, the kind of place we'd only go to on special occasions. She was meeting him there Saturday night, a day she had told me she'd picked up an extra shift. It took everything in me to stay calm when she casually mentioned the shift over dinner Friday evening. She smiled as she twirled pasta onto her fork, her tone light as she said, "Don't wait up tomorrow night. I'll probably be home late." I forced a smile in return. "No problem. I'll keep busy." The lie came easily to her, as though it were second nature. It made me sick. Saturday arrived, and I played my part well. I kissed her goodbye at the door, pretending I wasn't watching her leave to meet someone else. As soon as the elevator doors closed behind her, I grabbed my keys and left the apartment. I parked down the street from La Bella and waited. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my pulse pounding in my ears as I watched the entrance. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, Amy walked in. She wasn't wearing her scrubs. Instead, she'd dressed in a blue dress I'd bought her for our last anniversary, the one that brought out the color in her eyes. A minute later, Jeff arrived. He was older, just as I'd guessed, with gray streaks in his hair and a broad build. He wore a tailored jacket, his posture confident as he greeted the hostess. She led him to the table where Amy was waiting. I watched as they exchanged smiles, the kind I hadn't seen on Amy's face in years. It was intimate, personal, like they were the only two people in the world. I couldn't sit there any longer. I needed to see it up close. La Bella had large windows, and from where I parked, I could see their table clearly. As I walked past, pretending to check my phone, I glanced in. They were leaning close, talking in hushed tones. Jeff reached across the table, covering Amy's hand with his. She didn't pull away. My stomach churned, a mix of rage and heartbreak threatening to overwhelm me. I kept walking, afraid that if I stayed too long, I'd burst through the doors and cause a scene. I needed to keep my composure. Back in my car, I stared at the dashboard, my breathing shallow. The image of them together burned in my mind. There was no denying it anymore. Amy wasn't just lying, she was in love with someone else. The next morning, she returned home as if nothing had happened. She kissed my cheek, asked how my evening was, and told me how busy her shift had been. Her lies came so easily, her face a mask of innocence. But now I knew. I had seen the truth with my own eyes. And soon, she would have no choice but to face it too. The day after I saw them together at La Bella, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Amy, sitting across from him, her face glowing with a happiness I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just infidelity, it was intimacy, the kind that only grows over time. My stomach twisted every time I thought about it. That morning, Amy was unusually cheerful. She made us breakfast, humming softly as she flipped pancakes. She even brought me a plate, setting it down with a warm smile. "You've been quiet," she said, sitting across from me. Everything okay? I stared at her, struggling to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I'd seen the night before. How could she sit here, so at ease, when I felt like my world was crumbling? Yeah, I lied, forcing myself to look away. Just tired. She nodded, sipping her coffee. You should take a day off soon. Maybe we could do something together, go to the park or out for dinner. Dinner. The word hit like a punch. Last night's dinner, the stolen moment she shared with him, wasn't even a blip on her radar of guilt. I forced a smile, murmuring something about checking my schedule. After she left for her shift, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty plate in front of me. My mind raced, alternating between despair and anger. I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. She needed to know I'd found out. But I wasn't ready for an all-out confrontation, not yet. I needed more control over the situation, and that meant waiting until I could do it on my terms. That evening, when Amy returned home, she barely seemed to notice my subdued mood. She breezed through the door, tossing her bag on the counter and kissing my cheek before heading to the bedroom. I followed her, watching as she changed out of her scrubs and into her usual comfortable pajamas. She looked so normal, so familiar. And yet, I couldn't unsee what I now knew about her. Busy day? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She shrugged. The usual. Nothing exciting. Her lies stung, even though I was bracing for them. I nodded, forcing myself to act as though nothing was wrong. That night, as she slept beside me, I made a decision. The time for quietly collecting evidence was over. If Amy was going to live two lives, she needed to face what she'd done. And I needed to know the full truth, no more fragments, no more guesswork. The next morning, I woke early, leaving the apartment before Amy had even stirred. I drove to a private investigator's office I'd found online during one of my sleepless nights. The investigator, a sharp-eyed man named David, listened quietly as I explained the situation. I told him everything, the messages, the dinner at La Bella, the man named Jeff. David nodded, his expression calm and professional. I can help, he said. We'll track her movements, get a clear picture of what's happening. It'll take time, but if there's more to uncover, we'll find it. I felt a flicker of relief, though it was quickly swallowed by the weight of what I was setting in motion. This wasn't just about catching Amy in a lie, it was about dismantling the life I thought we'd built together. That evening, I returned home, my resolve stronger than it had been in days. Amy was waiting for me, her expression warm as she asked about my day. I played along, but inside, the pieces of my plan were clicking into place. Soon, there would be no more pretending. No more secrets. The following days were some of the longest of my life. Every interaction with Amy felt like a test of my patience and composure. She moved through our shared routines with the same ease as always, while I carried the crushing weight of what I knew. My chest tightened every time her phone buzzed or she casually mentioned her work schedule. I didn't trust myself to respond naturally, so I kept my conversations short and safe. David, the investigator, worked quickly. He sent me updates through a secure app, his messages precise and professional. Amy wasn't just seeing Jeff occasionally, she was meeting him often. Lunches on her breaks, dinners when she was working late, and, more than once, overnight stays at a hotel just outside of town. Each detail felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. On Wednesday, David sent me photographs. They showed Amy and Jeff at the same hotel I'd seen mentioned in her messages. They stood in the parking lot, close enough that their bodies nearly touched. In one picture, Jeff's hand rested on her back as they walked toward the entrance. Another showed them laughing together, Amy tilting her head toward him in a way that made my stomach churn. That night, as Amy sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone, I couldn't bring myself to look at her. The photographs burned in my mind, more real and damning than anything else I'd seen so far. My hands curled into fists, but I kept my voice steady. "Tough day?" she asked, her tone casual. I shook my head. "Just the usual." She nodded, her attention already drifting back to her screen. She seemed so at ease, so unaffected. I couldn't tell if she was oblivious to my tension or simply that good at ignoring it. The next morning, David called with one final update. "I've got everything you need," he said. "There's no room for doubt anymore." He wasn't exaggerating. The evidence was overwhelming: messages, photos, timelines, even receipts for the hotel stays. It was all there, laid out in stark, undeniable detail. My chest tightened as I stared at the file he'd sent me. This was it. The truth, cold and brutal, laid bare. That evening, I returned home determined to confront Amy. I couldn't carry this secret any longer, couldn't pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. She needed to see what I'd found, and I needed to hear her explain how she could do this to me, how she could destroy 30 years of marriage without a second thought. When she walked through the door, I was already waiting in the living room. The file sat on the coffee table, its presence heavy and unavoidable. She paused when she saw me, her eyes flickering to the folder. "What's this?" she asked, her tone hesitant. I gestured for her to sit. My voice was calm, but my heart pounded so hard I thought she might hear it. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed as she sat across from me, her movements slow and deliberate. "What's going on, Robert?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I slid the folder toward her. "Open it." Amy's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the file. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the first few pages. Her face paled as she realized what she was looking at. "Robert, Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't say anything until you've looked through all of it." She hesitated but continued turning the pages. With each one, her expression shifted, from confusion to shock, and finally, to something that looked like resignation. When she reached the photographs, she closed the file and set it down, her hands folded in her lap. "I can explain," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. My chest burned with anger and betrayal. "Explain," I said, my voice trembling. "You've been lying to me for years, Amy. Meeting him behind my back. Telling me you're working late while you're off with him. What exactly is there to explain?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in all this, she looked truly lost. And in that moment, I realized there were no words that could fix this. No explanation that would make the pain go away. Amy sat there, silent, her gaze fixed on the file in front of her. The weight of the moment pressed down on both of us, thick and suffocating. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat a reminder of how close I was to losing everything I thought we had. "You need to say something," I finally managed, my voice tight with the effort it took to stay calm. "You owe me that much." She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Robert, I'm so sorry," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word, but it did nothing to soften the ache in my chest. "Sorry," I repeated bitterly, the word tasting like ash. "You're sorry. For what, Amy? For cheating? For lying? For throwing away 30 years of marriage? Be specific." Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her words muffled. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then how was it supposed to be?" I snapped, my anger finally bubbling over. "You've been sneaking around with him for years, Amy. Years. And you didn't think that would hurt me?" She flinched, but I didn't stop. "Do you even understand what you've done? You've destroyed us. You've destroyed everything we built together. For what? For him." Her head shot up at that, and for a moment, something like defiance flickered in her eyes. "It wasn't just for him," she said, her voice steadier now. "It was for me too." I blinked, stunned by her audacity. "For you?" I repeated. "What does that even mean?" Amy took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. "I didn't plan this, Robert. It just happened. Jeff and he made me feel seen again. Like I mattered. Her words felt like a slap. "Seen?" I said, incredulous. "You've always mattered to me. You're my wife, Amy. You're the mother of my child. How could you possibly think otherwise?" Her eyes filled with tears again, and she shook her head. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "For years, I felt like we were just coasting. Like we were roommates instead of a couple. And Jeff, he was there when I needed someone to talk to. It started out innocent, I swear." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and grating. "Innocent? Is that what you call hotel rooms and secret messages? Don't insult me, Amy." She winced but didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at her hands, silent once more. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. "So, what now?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Do you love him?" Amy hesitated, and the silence that followed was deafening. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know." The words were like a dagger to my chest. "You don't know," I repeated, shaking my head. "You've been with him for years, and you don't know." Tears streamed down her face now, and she reached out as if to touch me, but I pulled back. "Robert, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted it to get this far. I never wanted to lose you." "But you did," I said, my voice cold and firm. "You made your choices, Amy. And now we have to deal with the consequences." She sobbed, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Instead, I stood, looking down at the woman I'd shared my life with for 30 years and feeling like I didn't know her at all. "I need time to think," I said, my voice quieter now. "Don't expect me to forgive you." I walked out of the room before she could respond, closing the door behind me. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just happened. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if we could ever recover. The next few days passed in a fog. Amy stayed in the apartment, quiet and subdued, giving me space. We didn't speak beyond the bare minimum, and even those exchanges felt strained, like walking on shattered glass. I moved through my routines mechanically, but every corner of the apartment reminded me of the life we had built, and how easily it had crumbled. On the third evening, as I sat alone in the living room staring blankly at the TV, Amy came in. She hesitated at the edge of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Robert," she began softly. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back. And I know I don't deserve anything from you after what I've done. But I need to say this." I didn't look at her, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. "Say what you need to say." She took a shaky breath. "I ended it with Jeff. It's over." Those words hung in the air, but they didn't land the way I thought they might. Instead of relief, I felt an overwhelming emptiness. "That's supposed to make this better?" I asked, my voice flat. "Like it erases what you've done?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I know it doesn't. I know I've broken your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that I'm done living that lie." Finally, I turned to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She looked like a shadow of the confident woman I'd known for so long. "Why now?" I asked. "Why end it now?" "Because I realized what I was losing," she said, her voice trembling. "You, Emma, the life we built, I let myself forget how much they mattered. And now I see that I might not have the chance to make it right. But I had to start somewhere." Her words sounded sincere, but the damage was done. The foundation of our marriage had been shattered, and no amount of apologies could piece it back together. "I need time, Amy," I said finally. "I need to figure out what's next for me, for us, if there even is an us." She nodded slowly, her tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I'll give you all the time you need." In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. I started therapy, something I never thought I'd need, and found an outlet for the tidal wave of emotions I'd been carrying. I told Emma the truth, not everything, but enough for her to understand why things at home had changed. She was shocked and hurt, but she supported me in ways I hadn't expected. Her love reminded me that I still had a future, even if it looked different from the one I'd imagined. Amy moved out shortly after. She left a note on the kitchen table the morning she left, promising to give me space and telling me that she'd always love me, no matter what. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Months passed, and while the pain didn't disappear, it dulled. I learned to live with it, to accept that my marriage was over. The life I had built with Amy was gone, but I was still standing. And in that, I found a small sliver of hope. One day, as I stood on the balcony of our apartment, staring out at the skyline of our little town, I felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to take the first step.